So good morning. We're going to let people kind of filter in a little bit, and then we'll get started. We're joined today by Professor Mary Murphy of Maynooth University, who, for anyone who's interested in the area of social policy, Mary will be well known. Teaching in Maynooth for a number of years. She's also been involved in the sector for more years than she'd care for me to mention. Both as, you know, in the world of politics and campaigning. She's been a member of NESC and has written a number of papers and books. The latest one really is in an area that, for those of you who were involved in our Simon Week or aware of our Simon Week conference or attended, it would have actually sat quite neatly there. One of the things we've been looking at, I suppose, in developing our own thinking is a recognition that there are actually now multiple challenges facing the world, but Ireland in particular. Obviously, our particular focus is on the housing crisis and more particularly the homelessness crisis. But we also have to recognize that there's also an environmental crisis that needs to be addressed, and that, you know, the world is becoming more unequal and the challenges are global. So we're always looking for ways that we can, I suppose, rethink those ideas and engage with them in different and useful ways. And thankfully, Mary has, in her thinking, produced a way of drawing together the different strands and how we might move forward in a slightly different model. So I won't spend too long talking, other than just to say the usual housekeeping things. If you are going to tweet or use social media about the event today, please do, and do use the hashtag Simon Talks. We will, this is recorded, so we will send on the video afterwards, or it should be up on YouTube. And other than that, I am going to hand over to Mary. If there is any questions that occur, do put them into the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll deal with them at the end. Okay, thank you, Mary.
Thanks, Wayne, and thanks for the invite. Yeah, like as Wayne said, I'm 20 years in academic, and before that I was 20 years in lobbying and campaigning around inequality, unemployment and poverty. So I call myself a pracademic, which is somebody who crosses the boundaries between practical kind of influencing work, in my case, and then the more academic side of it. And I hope to show that that's kind of useful to do, and that this book brings together the sort of the knowledge and experience from the 20 years of campaigning and lobbying alongside the more academic and theoretical work. So this book was launched in May, and thank you to all involved in its production, including Policy Press. I'm just going to go on and just show you one slide there, which is a slide that I made because really the book is about animating conversation. It's not really an academic book. It's not really for an academic audience. It's divided into 9 chapters, and this web diagram sort of symbolizes the way the book is structured, with the yellow, blue and red of the web being very different parts and functions of the book. So the yellow bit looks at why are we in the state we are in, and it tries to make the links between inequality and climate change. It shows that the type of political economy we have, the nature of contemporary capitalism, leads to excessive inequality and carbon emissions, and they are very much linked. The most carbon emissions are produced in the interest of and by the rich, simply because they are rich and pursuing excessive consumption, whilst the poor, who don't have money to spend on excessive consumption, aren't contributing that much at all to climate change, really. So when we try and link the two of them together, both in a global north country like Ireland, but particularly vis-a-vis global north and global south, we see that you can't really talk about climate change without talking about inequality, and that any solutions that emerge to tackle climate change have to also tackle inequality. And in that way, I think it's quite useful to try and get our heads around a way of thinking about it that is what I call ecosocial, where ecological ends are pursued with social ends in a very combined way, so that you're doing both at the same time. So that's the overall logic and argument of the book, that you need to address both climate change and inequality simultaneously with similar policy instruments, and be very mindful of the impact that climate policy has on inequality and that inequality has on climate. The blue part of the book is more the social policy part of the book. The yellow, the first part, is more political economy. So the social policy tries to argue that, look, we have a welfare state at the moment, and my argument is the way it's developed, the way it's oriented at the moment, it's actually part of the problem. It's setting up welfare in a way that's really reinforcing the worst excesses and the worst values of capitalism. And that what we need to do is change what's in the welfare state, not necessarily getting rid of every bit of it, because there are some really good things in the welfare state, but really getting our heads around a fundamentally different type of welfare, a welfare system and a welfare future that's not necessarily as predicated on the state as our contemporary welfare state is. And I argue in that there are three fundamental things, foundational things, that we probably need in an eco-social welfare future. One, and it's number 4 there in the icon, it's enabling institutions. It's institutions that enable people to be in control of and to be autonomous actors in their own lives. So good community development, good education systems, good active labour market, ones that really do enable people to live the lives they want to live and enable people to do as much as possible themselves, which I argue our present system doesn't always do. Number 5 is the idea of changing how we think about services at the moment to universal basic services. So this is the idea that, and housing is the very obvious example here, or transport maybe, where we think of meeting people's needs to travel or to be housed by individual solutions to things. And that means that there's excessive carbon emissions built up. If we're all trying to get an individual solution to our travel, we all individually own a car, and the carbon emissions associated with that are extremely high. If we think of more collective solutions like public transport, where we share how to meet our needs, logically the carbon emissions will be much lower. So the idea of universal basic services, whether it's in relation to health or education or transport or housing or care or libraries, the same logic applies to it all, that we try and generate services to meet our basic needs that are collective services, so that they are less likely to be generating very significant carbon emissions from them. So the future, I would argue, is very service orientated. Services will play a really big role in how we get our needs met in the future. But we will always need money, and we will always need some form of income support, even if it plays a smaller and more complementary role to services. So number 6 there is about what I argue we need to change our welfare system to, away from things like job seekers payments and towards what I call participation income, an income support that goes to a much broader range of people, that socially values and is paid in respect of socially useful work, whether that's ecological work, caring work, democratic work, cultural work. A good example of it is how we're approaching the basic income for artists, where they can get an income. They call it basic income for artists, I call it participation income, but basically it tops up the money that they have, and it enables them to do work that's socially valued, the cultural and artistic work that we all want. So my eco-social welfare future is premised around those 3 fundamental things: strong, enabling, often quite local institutions that fundamentally accommodate care in people's lives; good universal basic services that really enable us meet our needs collectively; and an income support that socially values the roles that we play in enabling socially useful things to happen. And that if we have those 3 things, we can build lots of other policies around them. The red part of the book looks at the how do we do this? What's the politics of that change? And there's lots of different ways of doing that. We could look from an elite perspective at environmental governance and welfare state governance, the role of political parties, the role of elite actors, the role of the EU. There are lots of really complex ways of trying to examine how change happens. But what I wanted to do in this book was show that what we needed to do in the very first instance is create an analysis and a demand for that type of change. And to my mind, that needs 3 things. it needs us to collectively mobilize. And it needs us to mobilize in a way that includes everybody, that includes people who are relying on the welfare state, and which links issues about climate and the welfare state, so that you get as many people mobilized as possible. So inclusive mobilization about everybody, that leaves nobody behind, is really important. The light bulb refers to ideas, imagination, framing, language. And I think it's a really important part in trying to create demand from below, that we get frames, we get ways of understanding things, like the link between climate and inequality, like caring societies. We get frames that everybody can buy into and everybody can see themselves in. So how we construct our own language is really important in making it constructive, in making it offensive, in enabling people to be part of a demand for something, which is much more positive than always being against something. So the book talks quite a lot about what we need to do to frame things positively, and looks at some examples, even from Irish history, of when things are framed well, it enables demand to emerge and to be articulated in much more creative ways. The last chapter of the book looks at joining the dots, and it argues very forcefully that one of the biggest problems we have, and I don't know if the homeless sector can relate to this, is how siloed we all are in our individual campaigns. So people in this Zoom call probably do homelessness. They're very clear about that. That's the protests they go on. That's the meetings and the seminars they go on. Somebody else does climate change. Somebody else does gender equality. Somebody else does something else. And the problem is that we all let our small individual groups go off and do the things, and we never really achieve the critical mass we need. So my argument is that the framing needs to help us join the dots and be inclusive of each other's campaigns, so that the demand is much more critical and of a scale that will actually shift elite politics into action, and will actually give political actors the confidence to take the risks, to take on the corporate power that's there, that is so strong. And unless we can match some of that strength from below, then the political actors who are kind of caught in the middle, if you like, will never feel that they have the societal support to do what needs to be done. So I think joining together and creating that critical mass is really, really important. So in essence, that's kind of the way the book is structured. And the next slide just looks at that in a little bit more detail, about 3 chapters in each of those sections and how it goes. And just to say to anybody who's thinking of reading the book, you don't need to read it all. Like, some people won't read the yellow bit. They might be more interested in the blue bit, and they might skim through the red bit. Some people only read the red bit. I know that, they've told me. Some people only read the yellow bit. So it's not designed that you have to read it all, but ideally, if you can read it all, it's all the better. Now, I just wanted people to have a look at this slide for a moment, and particularly at the image in the slide. And at first glance, what people see is the image of a march. But at a second glance, when people look at it a bit more, and I ask students this a lot, what do you see? And they see lots of things. They see things I never saw, like they see it's mainly men marching, and they think that's why I put it up. But actually what it is 2 images of 2 different marches. The one where there is no Planet B is very clearly a climate change, environmental oriented march. And the other one, Welfare Not Workfare, is a welfare oriented march. And I put them up really to show, to drive home the point that we are not coherently organising our collective demands for change in a way that gives us the critical mass that we need. You really see that sometimes when you go on marches. Like, there's certain people not on some marches and on other marches. Some of your mates are on some marches and not other marches. So that image is really just about trying to get us thinking about what message are we really sending back when we make these sort of demands and we don't integrate them and we don't have an analysis that can frame them. The other thing the slide is saying is just about the urgency of now, which is getting more and more urgent. I mean, we used to talk about we have a decade. Now things really need to be done within this decade. And the book talks about that a lot. How can you strategize? How can you make these kind of demands for policy change in a very truncated time frame when things really have to work? And I think one of the things that the book tries to say, therefore, is that you need to be cognizant of what kind of policy can be implemented quickly, can be implemented maybe incrementally on top of what's already there. How can we build on the seeds of what's already there rather than totally flattening what's already there and starting anew? Because the time may not be there to actually break something down and rebuild. It may be that we have to transition from A to B. I think that's a really important part then of looking at what policies can help you make that transition in a timely kind of way. Now, I'm very conscious that this book is about climate and inequality, and I'm talking to people whose main focus is on homelessness and housing. And I wanted to spend a bit of time, this isn't in the book, but I've taken this work from Jenny Stevens, who is an American-based academic, but who has done a lot of work to try and think out loud about, well, what are the links between housing, homelessness, inequality, climate change, and climate action? And all these images are actually from the States because I took them from her book. But one is just the way people are actually emerging with frames themselves. So our house is on fire, the earth is our home, the framing and the imagery of Earth as a planet that is our home brings us directly into housing and homes in a very direct way in terms of how people are thinking about climate. And I think there's something in that that's kind of interesting. The Green New Deal for public housing was a really innovative, imaginative campaign in the United States a couple of years ago. And really what they made, like the Green New Deal was about an approach to tackling climate change that really had inequality at the center of it. And the first policy platform that they emerged with was this one, where they tried to give substance to the argument about tackling climate change and inequality together by focusing on public housing. It could have been focusing on public transport. It could have been focusing on public care services, but they chose to really, they thought that public housing was a way of bringing that together a lot more. Moms for Housing, a very innovative campaign in Oakland in California, where mothers occupied a vacant house to really highlight the irony of having so much vacant housing at a time of homelessness. Their campaign emerged into a fairly large scale campaign that generated some policy changes. And they very carefully made the links themselves to the direct issue of vacant housing, to corporate wealth inequality and climate change. They framed it that way themselves as they began to think about and understand better what was going on. So there are lots of different ways and lots of different angles to try and situate a way of understanding climate change, inequality and homelessness that are really practical and that can actually get traction in the public's imagination. The last one there, City Life, Vida or Rana, is an interesting one where it's a city-based one, and it's asking about, well, what kind of city do we want? And it's arguing for planning policy, for housing development, for community development, and a range of city planning issues that both address inequality and climate change at the same time. And we get very innovative policy ideas when we try to do that. And I just wanted to go on in the next slide to talk a little bit about what's underneath a lot of this thinking in relation to housing inequality and climate inequality. So I've already argued that the loss of home and shelter is already an issue with climate change in the framing our house is on fire. But at a more practical level, what we're seeing is that people lose their home and their shelter in the consequences of climate change, of flooding, of wildfire. And whilst we're not seeing that so much in Ireland right now, I think it doesn't take much in our imagination to begin to see how it could happen with the kind of flooding that is going on at the moment. But we see lots of other issues emerging like on our tellies on an almost weekly basis, where people are losing homes very directly. And what we're seeing in Ireland, I think, is really interesting. And Jenny Stevens makes this point, and I haven't really seen it made in Ireland because the politics of making the point are very, very difficult to do at a time when people's businesses have been flooded and they're seeking compensation. But Jenny Stevens makes the point that if we don't income proof to some degree the way we're managing compensation of flooding, for instance, the way we are managing it is actually distributionally unequal and is likely potentially to increase income inequality overall if we don't do it in a different way. So that leads into greater inequality, and we're making the argument that inequality is linked to climate emissions. So to some degree, some of our policies in responding to climate change may be reinforcing inequality and maybe reinforcing some of the problems that are feeding into climate problems down the road. So we can't afford to have non-climate compatible responses to climate change or to inequality. So the kind of things that come up when you're talking in a practical sense are, that injustice of homelessness and vacant homes, the degree to which rental policies at the moment, the rent to buy, is producing levels of vacancy, and where developers are holding on to vacant homes in order to manipulate the market price of rental property. The injustice of that feeds very much into a growing inequality in the world and links directly to climate change in that sense. I think another thing in housing that we see in climate a lot is a reliance on market solutions to both housing and climate, and that we can link framing in a conversation about where do we need to look for the solutions to both of these things. There are very obvious things like the level of carbon emissions in our buildings, and the degree to which pressure to increase housing supply is to some degree emboldening some developers to argue for lesser standards, and some of those standards make housing more vulnerable to climate change in the future. So I think that's a space that we need to be more mindful of. The idea of retrofitting public housing, obviously retrofitting more generally, but again, the distributional implications of retrofitting policy, who gets it, who can afford it, who doesn't get it, and the distributional implications of all housing policy, really. Issues around planning guidelines. And one thing I often notice myself, and again, this isn't something that is easy to say, but if we take the MICA campaign, a really powerful campaign, which we can learn a lot from in terms of how do you mobilize demand for something, a very, very politically insightful campaign. But one thing that really struck me was the size of a lot of the houses that needed to be compensated for in the MICA frame were very, very large. And really, I wondered whether or not there was any thinking about climate in the scale and size of some of what we're giving planning permission for, particularly maybe in the scale of some of what we see in more rural housing. They are going to be incredibly expensive and incredibly anti-climate to begin to try and heat over time. There's the idea of compensating businesses more than homes and what that means. And then there's the whole issue of climate gentrification. And this is the idea that as we see areas becoming vulnerable to flood, we see people moving out of those areas. Those areas are still there. They are likely to become the areas where cheaper, more transitory housing, and particularly maybe homeless services are. And we need to watch that space very, very carefully. I think there's more direct links as well between climate and inequality, particularly when we think of the Sustainable Development Goal mantra of leave no one behind. Because if we look in a really, really practical sense at big climate events that have happened, and we haven't seen them so much in Ireland yet to be able to judge it, but if you look at New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina, there's really, really well documented evidence that the people that were left behind, and I mean literally behind, sitting on the roofs of flooded buildings, fighting for their lives. They were the poor, they were Black, they were often lone parents, and they were often older people. If we look at the California fires, we know that people who had vehicular access, who could drive themselves out of places where they had to abandon their homes very quickly. And we know in other instances, those who can pay for flights to evacuate areas are those who can get out first. And that often the poorest, without vehicular access, without the capacity to pay for flights themselves in the first instance, are those who are left behind and are very dependent on state policy to evacuate them, which often isn't serviced well enough to do that job. So we know as well, homeless people are often housed in the vulnerable, cheapest housing, which will be most vulnerable to flooding and climate change. We know that a consequence of homelessness is less community stability and less democratic power as an actor in society. And that has an impact on homeless people's capacity to, again, in relation to being left behind in campaigns, being left behind when communities build resilience plans around climate change. We know that local community responses are vital. and local will become much, much more significant. And being embedded in a local community and not being pushed out of it by homelessness or moved around cities. I come into the train to Maynooth every day on the train, and I see every single day, and it breaks my heart, at the train station in Drumcondra, I see people who are living in homeless hubs in the city area, broad area of the inner suburbs, and they are bussing back out to areas where their kids are in school. Kids are in buggies, they're asleep on the train, they're being pushed off, they're in little school uniforms. It's horrible. So those people don't get a chance to embed themselves in local communities and be part of local responses. So overall, I really want to push that line that reducing inequality is part and parcel of reducing climate change, and reducing climate change is part and parcel of reducing inequality. But I think within that, and what my book really tries to do, is to talk about welfare and poverty at the same time, because I think one of the problems about climate change more generally is it's very focused on the environmental technocratic kind of solutions that are, some of which do need to be done in relation to climate change. But because of that, an awful lot of people it's not that so much that they turn off the conversation, they just don't see the conversation as being relevant to them. And I think by bringing in issues like housing or care or health into a more fundamental climate change discussion, it can open it up to much more people. So the starting point with people has to be, how is your life? What are the things that affect you? And how does climate interact with them? That is a different way of starting a conversation than saying, you are part of the problem and this is what the solution is, without people's voice being part of it. So in bringing welfare into the picture, and I'm conscious of the time there, Shane, so don't worry, I'm going to stop. The original welfare state, we often hear of Beveridge and the five evils in 1942, and the welfare state emerging out of crisis, and the five evils being want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness. But Thompson in 2022 tried to reframe what were the issues facing the welfare state now, and he called them 8 giants. And he said it's inequality and polarization, economic insecurity, consumer debt, stress and mental illness, precarity and rising underemployment, AI, climate breakdown, and rising populism and neo-fascism. And to my mind, these are all the same thing in terms of how people are feeling. They are seeing all these things coming at them, and they are feeling very insecure and vulnerable. And Naomi Klein made the point in Dublin a few weeks ago that, one thing that the populism and the far right often tap into in a correct way are people's feelings. They get the feelings right, but the facts completely wrong. Whereas often progressives are very focused on the facts, but they forget to engage with people around how they are feeling in the consequence of what's facing them going down the line. So I think what welfare needs to do in the future is kind of different to what it needs to do in the past. I also think welfare is increasingly part of the problem at the moment. So we used to think of welfare as decommodifying people, as taking people, making sure that they could provide for their security independent of the market. So if we think of lone parents, for example, they would have received a payment that didn't require them to be actors in the labour market. They were assured of being able to care for their children and themselves. Increasingly, under the guise of things like social investment policy and activation policy, we're really pushing people more and more towards labour market participation. And welfare is becoming a more commodifying thing. It's pushing people into the market, maybe rather than protecting people from the market. So we need to turn welfare on its head a little bit in that respect. And I think in doing that and trying to turn welfare on its head, some of the organizational principles, if you like, that we can try and think about are that inequality and climate change are different sides of the same coin and need welfare-based solutions to both. That a lot of those welfare-based solutions are about reorganizing our time, our work, our money, our care of ourselves, care of each other, care of nature. So we need to think quite innovatively about time. And I think things like participation income, universal basic services, reduction in working time, they all help us redivide up the cake of resources available to us so that we can live our lives differently and do different things in our lives, things that are more compatible with climate reduction, emissions reduction. I think the other thing that we need to do, and this is really important in the context of time and having time, is that this needs to be done democratically, inclusively, with the active participation of people through enabling institutions. And that's no small ask. One of the biggest tensions there is in thinking about climate change and inequality is that, and we see it more and more maybe, that people are more and more thinking about eco-authoritarianism as a way of needing to do things quickly and implement maybe some of the more technocratic environmental solutions. That scares the living daylights out of me. I really think we need to hang on to basic principles of democracy and try and enable new mechanisms of democracy to enable people to be part of the conversation about what's happening as we're moving forward. And that's why the enabling institutions are really important. How our education systems, how our democratic institutions, how our community development institutions enable people to be part of the conversation about all of this is very, very important. So I'm going to end on this actually, because I think it is important when I'm talking about the time image and trying to reimagine welfare, and that concept of institutional imagination is really important. We're not very good at it, I don't think. We're quite siloed in our own imaginations. So how do we build an eco-social imaginary, a political social imaginary to get us from A to B? And there's this argument that, the seeds of the future are already in the present to some degree. So it's about looking at the welfare system and saying, well, what's good in it that we can take forward? And there are some good things in it. There are universal payments, and there are enabling institutions. There's some good, like primary education now is getting better and better. And we have some good active labour market programmes for good community development. We have already got some care related payments. So the idea of socially valuing care, of enabling people to care principle is there. And that relates to having some unconditional payments. We're used to the idea of providing social supports to meet needs. And we're used to the idea of gender equality requires individual access to payments. There's movement there on pensions, particularly with the recent work on the Commission on Pensions. So I think it is about trying to look at changing how we approach our services, changing how we approach our income supports, and changing how we maintain and develop our institutions, our welfare institutions, broadly speaking, in order that they are as proactive as possible in setting us up to be the world that we need to be capable of managing climate change into the future. So I leave it at that, Wayne, maybe, because I think that's probably enough.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Mary. Thank you so much. And I think it throws up a huge amount of questions for anyone who's interested in housing and homelessness, and certainly anyone who's campaigning on it. I suppose there's a couple of things that kind of jump out. You addressed it really in the last slide, I think, in an interesting way. But there is that sense of one of the things when you work on homelessness or on the housing, is that you get in, particularly in the politics of it, or even in the service provision, you get we're doing that already. Famously, that was the housing first model when it was, came out. It was kind of sure, put people into home, provide them with support. We're doing that already, but it didn't have the same level of success. So there was a certain fidelity to the principles that was needed, and those really had to be spelled out and sort of communicated and discussed and developed. And I just wonder, in that you've identified some of the seeds of success, but they're also a risk in that people will feel, actually, we're doing it already. So you want to build on those seeds, or that's mixing me metaphors again. But I suppose, what are the fidelity that is needed to actually move those seeds and to allow them to grow roots and to sprout?
I think to some degree it's about one thing I didn't say earlier on is we are facing into fairly fundamental change over the next decade, and we don't necessarily know what that change will be, but we do need a compass to guide us through the change. And I'm not suggesting that universal basic services or enabling institutions or participation income is the compass. I think the eco-social welfare future is the compass, and these are just foundational steps that you would put in order to build a sort of a basic raft in order to get from A to B. So I think if you're talking about how do you appraise the problem, people say, well, we already have services and we already have income support and we already have institutions. You need to reimagine what they are trying to be if the compass is an eco-social welfare future. And I think the idea of like the Housing First is probably a good example where we tend to do a lot of things kind of half-baked, I think, in Ireland. I mean, I think third level education as a good example of it as well, maybe. But it is really trying to develop, well, if these were really enabling institutions, how would they be organised? If they were democratic institutions, how would they be organised? If they were localised, how would they be organised? If they were capable of enabling community responses to things like climate change, how would they be organised? And it's about trying to like literally trigger the imagination of how do you get them better and how do you get them more fit for purpose in moving towards a future that we don't necessarily know what it would look like, but we're trying to determine what it would look like. We're trying to control to the degree we can what this thing might be like in the future. So I think it's about, like, say for example, care as a principle. Really, how if we proved all those policies to make sure that they were care, that they enabled us to care for ourselves, for each other, for the planet, we would find out very quickly and very easily, I think, that they don't. So to some degree, I think having a set of principles that can guide what should one of these look like. So we used to talk about poverty proofing, we used to talk about equality proofing. To some degree, it's not that dissimilar. It's what's the yardsticks against which we're measuring the capacity of these institutions to be future resilient in a way that meets some of what they will need to be like in the future. And I think, for example, like the lack of integration between homeless organisations and local community infrastructure is a good example of, if they're not conjoined in some way, then any local responses to deal with flooding, to deal with X, Y, Z, will not incorporate those homeless services. And they don't at the moment, I'm pretty sure. You're right, so conversations like that need to be had, you know, the principle of inclusiveness, that the whole community needs to be engaged in democratic discussions about how to develop responses. So I think the other angle on it is that, okay, you say Housing First, it isn't as what it could be, maybe. But most people aren't on your march. They don't read your documents. They don't know what Housing First is because they're siloed. They know what environmental policy is or labour market policy is, and you're good on that, so you do that. And it means we need to talk to each other more. We need to listen to each other more. So a lot of the literature that's, I think, quite good on some of this is talking about deep listening, like getting over the sense that we're all doing our own thing and we're too busy and we haven't time. We just need to listen to each other. Like we don't have the luxury of not listening to each other anymore. So to some degree, people will accept the argument that Housing First isn't what it's supposed to be if they're listening to you, if they're talking to you, if you're talking to them, if you're doing things together more, if you're on each other's marches, you begin to open up those discussions more. And I think new ways of understanding and new ways of judging the efficacy of things can emerge through deep listening. I certainly found that myself, that, you know, any efforts I've been in that have involved the welfare movements, if you like, talking to the environmental movements, has left egg on both faces very, very obviously, in terms of, geez, I didn't know that. You know, I mean, really kind of shocking each other with basic information about each other's sectors, and also understanding each other's capacities for action a little bit more clearly. Like, you know, in terms of environmental actors, not saying, oh, nobody comes to our marches, it's really annoying, is saying, well, have you thought about what the obstacles are in terms of poverty, in terms of no access to, you know, like I think just some penny dropping conversations can happen when we have those conjoined conversations, and we'll never have them if we don't join up the issues in our head to start with. We'll never see the links between them.
So sorry, just to say to anyone, there is the Q&A box in the chat box. I'm going to continue this conversation because I find it fascinating, but if people want to ask a question, do please. I'm sure Mary would be more interested in your questions than mine. So you mentioned that in that slide, the thing about talking about or decreasing inequality is also decreasing or addressing climate change. If you're addressing one, you're addressing the other. And one of the things I suppose we've been thinking about in our thing is actually the paradigm possibly has to be wider than that. So we need to be thinking about, obviously, poverty is a huge issue. Obviously, climate change is a huge issue. And unsurprisingly, I'm going to say homelessness and the housing crisis is a huge issue. And you've addressed some of that. But we also think about the level of our national debt. We have to think about, as you said, care, health, immigration is going to be, because that is part of climate change as well, and part of housing as the even population growth. But we've had a migration to Ireland, and if that migration, as we all hope, will be a success, and we have in the past been good at integrating people, then we have chain migration, which is going to see more people coming to Ireland, and that is a sign of success, but it also comes with challenges. And I suppose, do we do it in the way that we take it in bite size and we start making the links, or is there a holistic way of approaching these things?
I mean, I suppose there's a lot of learning about what we did do and what we didn't do in relation to recent crises like Ukraine and maybe what's going on in Gaza at the moment. I think there's other things to differentiate, is what we do at a local level, national level, and EU level. And I think increasingly what we might see in the future, and I think it's one of the problems at the moment in why we don't talk to each other, is that, the EU has much more competence around some policies than others, and it has much more competence around environment than welfare, for example. So some of the conversations happen at an EU level, and some of the campaigns and lobbying is towards that direction, whereas the more they're more orientated towards national. And I think that there's an interesting thing there. So I don't know the degree to which some of the migration related policy will emerge and be framed at an EU level, and we're already very scarily seeing some of the Fortress Europe framing of it in relation to that. I think it is one area where Ireland could be a leader, though, as well, like in terms of pushing against some of the more dominant frames, just as we are doing with Palestine to some degree, and sort of trying to be a voice for a different articulation of what might be possible in relation to migration. It's where civil society in Ireland will need to stand up as well. But I think one area where I think is probably important to point out, and I didn't get onto it in the slide because I decided to talk, but it's the idea of universal basic services as a way of understanding how to relate the policies that can be more collective and can be more carbon reduction oriented when we respond. So when we think of housing and homelessness in the context of universal basic services, it enables us to think differently about the role of the state. So Anna Coote and Andrew Percy did most of the work on this in a UK context. But what they say very clearly is that we need to imagine two things in the future. One is that in some respects, the state has a bigger role, because it has to be a better regulator, a better planner, a better funder, and a better monitor of services. It has to make sure that all these things happen. But what it doesn't have to do is deliver any of them necessarily. It can be the funder, the regulator, the planner, the monitor of a diversity, plurality of service provision. And I think one thing that enables us to imagine maybe is to get into the idea of moving away from the council model of public housing to a different concept of public or social housing, where we're thinking of it housing tiny homes kind of idea, where there can be much more diversity in the governance arrangements for responding to housing need, where people can be much more proactive and local in relation to how they might respond to housing need. And when I say 1,000 tiny homes, I'm not arguing that we all, turn into goblins or something. My house is an old council house in Drumcondra. It comes under the label of a tiny home because it's less than 1,000 square foot. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I'm talking about pretty decent homes. But the idea would be that there could be much more variety in how we might be able to arrange those homes to be built and to be sustained over time. And that the society, takes on a much, much bigger role in the provision of housing. And I think in that context, more localized responses to migration, more community sponsorship responses and things like that have the potential to emerge. If we really see that the role of the state isn't about providing housing, it's about regulating the framework through which housing provision is delivered and enacted. I think there are some interesting angles in that, and interesting international examples of different forms of even, like, say, for example, one of them would be social licensing, where at the moment the state procures stuff through big construction companies to build houses for the local authority. If you turn that on its head and instead of procuring, you go after a format that's called social licensing, you're building who you're going to give the contract to deliver housing to much more deeply into other social objectives like community development or strong local government or climate change resilience. You're linking up the policy objectives in the design and provision of the funding and the regulation and the monitoring and the planning of it. So you're linking up in policy design what you want in policy practice and implementation. I think there's a lot of very creative things that can be done to just change how we go about doing things that come under that idea of universal basic services. So I haven't done justice to it here, because it is a way of just getting outside the box of how we think about the state and what the state should be and can do, and the demands that we as society make of the state to do X or Y, when it's very obvious sometimes that doing X or Y is really what we're saying is procure to the private market the provision of this service and call it a state service. That's not what we want. Like, it really isn't. That's what's making inequality. That's what's making carbon emissions. That's what's getting the children's hospital. That's blah. You know, like, that is not what we want. And yet that is what we are demanding of the state in the short term, a lot of the time for expedient reasons. So we need to think about what we're demanding and try and reframe some of it to get a much more creative outcome at the other end, one that is better integrated across all these kind of things.
So it's the call we need to work.
Yeah, it goes back to that idea maybe of framing, that sometimes maybe, you know, what do we want? When do we want it now? Is maybe not the best framing. You know, like that sometimes it is about saying, well, like can we think deeper and harder? Can we listen deeper to each other? Can we come up with multiple frames that we can see each other in? And can we begin to, well, like one example I give in the book are just, if you look at the 3 referendums in Ireland that won on divorce, on marriage equality and on repeal, all of them were really carefully framed. Like the first divorce referendum lost because people didn't want divorce, but it was reframed as right to remarry. People wanted that. So then marriage equality, that started out as same-sex marriage. That frame didn't work, marriage equality worked. An abortion frame probably wouldn't have worked. So the frame of care and compassion and choice worked. Like, so I think we really need to think hard. I think that framing is really important. And I'm not sure that we've ever really tried to make a collective frame that incorporates inequality and climate and is inclusive of people, and that you can talk about welfare in the same frame that you can talk about climate. I don't think that's ever been tried in Ireland. I'm not saying ecosocial is the frame to use. I couldn't think of a better word to use. Some people use the frame of degrowth. I don't think that's that useful a frame. Some people are using caring societies. I think that's probably maybe something in that. So I'm not saying I have that frame, but I'd like to be part of a conversation of collectively realising the frame. Jack Schenker is a journalist in The Guardian, and he argues these frames emerge from the fight, you know, like that. A language will emerge from the struggle on, not on this, I don't mean literally on the street, but you know what I mean, through campaigning and lobbying, a language will emerge that will be the frame. But if we don't start doing the campaigning collectively, a collective frame won't emerge.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of my thing. I'm going to anyway. Voloshinov, who was taught about, who talks about that reification of language. One of the issues there is it comes up, but as soon as the language is the language is created, it's also appropriated. So you're constantly having, and that's the problem for particularly working class movements, is that their language is constantly appropriated and becomes something else. So actually the frame itself is something that has to be rethought through. I'm just wondering, you mentioned there about, you know, the way we pay for services, the way that services are developing, going out to the market, and like going away from that would be a huge shift and would take time and rethinking. But I'm just wondering what you felt the road, because you mentioned development of more democratic institutions, or ownership, I suppose, of those. And it seems to me that one of the areas where we've really failed in that is our under-resourcing and undermining of local government.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, in Ireland, only 8% of our national expenditure goes out through the local. In Denmark, it's 64%. So, I mean, we're not at the races. We're in the bottom three of 30 odd European countries. So we're really poor, and some argue we've more of local administration than local government. It's so weak. So I do believe it's a really good area to, I mean, it's not a sexy area, and it's an area that it's quite hard to get people engaged in. But work I did with Forsa called Democracy Works If You Let It, tried to put out an agenda of what are the steps you could take if you were trying to enhance local government. And I suppose that's what I mean about making the links between all these things. Is I know it's quite hard to do when a lot of our civil society is organised around sectoral interests, and people's jobs are maintained on the basis of whose voice is heard loudest. But I do think it takes brave leadership, therefore, to try and create some of these conversations and to see that there is a benefit in enabling each other. But local government is something that nobody campaigns for, yet everybody would benefit from. And it could be things like that, or the caring society, or something where we all see the benefit in it. Like, none of us have anything to lose by better local government, except national politicians. They're the only people who have something to lose. Maybe I'm sure there are a lot more. That's a bit simplistic, but you know what I mean. It may be about saying, okay, let's try and we did try and do that. We tried to have some of those conversations in Forza, but we fell into COVID at the start of that. So yeah. I mean, it kind of finished. Procurement as well. I mean, I think the homeless sector, more than anybody, should understand that procurement and how it's managed in Ireland really doesn't realise the kind of enabling services that you want. It's realising cheaper than necessary and poor quality that really aren't sustainable. And we see that in a very practical way in relation to the struggle that some homeless services are having at the moment to survive. And so I think that we really do need to change how we do procurement in Ireland. We have really confused the concept of value for money with lowest cost bidder. And if we went back to value for money, we could get back into the conversation about social licensing and things like that, because value for money is value for society. And it can give us a much broader way of, you can do it within EU law, there's no question about that, but we can just need to be more imaginative. We've been so cautious in Ireland about how we've interpreted EU guidelines to do procurement that, that there's room to manoeuvre in all of this. And I'm always shocked at the amount of people who say, oh, but that's procurement, that's EU law, and you're kind of like, no, it's not. There are better ways, other ways of doing it. So that's about listening to each other as well, and not going off thinking, I've read the book. I know that, it is about actually having conversations with each other.
Yeah. And it's about changing the framework again, because it's instead of saying, we want this service, how cheaply can you get it? It's saying,
which is the dominant market-based frame for doing it. If you got your head out of that, 1,000 things are possible.
If you'd say we're willing to spend X, we know it costs X.
What's the best we can get for X?
Yeah.
That's a wholly different conversation.
And it allows competition as well. It doesn't get away from competition.
And even what kind of society do we want this X to fit into is even a better conversation.
Yeah. Just on, we're down to the last couple of minutes. So just as the last question, I just think that local authority, local democratic institutions conversation, I think is a really important one. And I just wonder then, thinking about campaigning and the way that we campaign and the way politics is going. And actually, I think part of the reason why they've gotten away with gutting of the local, and to some degree what has been done in national politics, is actually undermining public service and undermining the intentions and the what's the word, undermining people who run for office, and that sense that actually they're all there. If you're not with me, you're not just against me, but you're evil. That kind of discourse that, you know, isn't as prevalent as people think it is, but it is there.
Yeah.
And I think that allowing that dialogue and difference of ideas is really important. I'm just wondering if you've reflected on that and how.
Yeah, lots of people have, and lots of people have worked really hard to try and tie in democracy in relation to inequality and climate change, to make it three planks, if you like. Where a lot of people have settled on it is in relation to the concept of energy democracy, which I think is really interesting. And there are three takes on energy democracy. One is really working hard to put in place democratic, and they're usually local, infrastructure and institutions to enable energy policy to be democratically deliberated on and implemented locally. So you need local knowledge. You can't implement a local solution without local knowledge. And therefore, what local consultation needs to be is different. And that's one. Jenny Stevens has taken it a step further to call energy democracy. She looks for an intersectional kind of energy democracy, one that is very clear about inequality and gender in relation to bringing in race and gender equality into that framing of energy democracy, which I think is really important. So it's kind of an inclusive energy democracy. And there's a guy in Brazil called Roberto Ungar who uses the language of energy democracy in a different way. He calls for a high energy democracy, which I love the concept. And he doesn't mean energy like fossil fuel or, you know, he means energy in terms of mobilized people. So the energy of democracy is what he's looking for. And he's arguing that you need to regenerate the institutions of democracy. And here again, he's really local in what he's talking about. You need the state to have democratic institutions that enable high levels of mobilization of actors in order to get the kind of political momentum to adapt, to experiment, to institutionalize quickly some of what needs to be done in the context of climate change. Now, he's talking about everyday institutions like lowering the voting age, citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, deliberation, participation, you know, all that kind of stuff. But he's talking about it being done at a scale that we're not used to. And people who live in Bolivia and who lived in certain places in Brazil, they describe those kind of democracies in action where you had strong leadership at a national level that really tried to deepen and widen democracy at a local level and tried to generate a new way of being the citizen, the green citizen, the active citizen, whatever you want to call it. So I think relating those three notions of energy policy, inclusive energy policy and high energy democracy is really interesting. You know, I think there's loads in that space to dig into a little bit more, but they all rest on local. And I really like that. I really like that they, you know, because there's this thinking that the EU will get more important and the local will get more important and the national will actually get less relevant as time goes on, because, but that the EU potentially may get more autocratic as well. And therefore the local democracy may be really important in people experiencing power and in having some capacity to shape the local lives that they're living, which will be, their lives will be more local as well. That's important in terms of thinking about the future. Welfare will be more local. All these institutions will be local because the reality of climate change is that we have to be local.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think and that in itself creates more, because if you think like big issues like climate change, you also have to think infrastructure and
yeah, I mean,
it's
quite head-wracking because you got to think on both levels and you got to think deeper, broader, wider. But that's what the book is saying: is we need to change how we think, we need to change how we talk, we need to change how we act, we need to change how we listen. And nothing changes if nothing changes. If we just keep being the civil society that we were in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, then see ya.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really interesting dynamic to actually. Because I know when I started working in this area, one of the things I found was there was these really useful tools, and it was constantly used by the sector as we can hold government to account with this, but nobody ever asked the question, well, do we hold ourselves to account?
Yeah,
and use it to hold ourselves to account. And I think that's really the challenge that part
of
it.
I think if we're looking for a smaller role for the market, which I am in my book, and I think a lot of people would be, like, you know, if you're looking to change things like procurement and things like that, and then you're looking for a different, maybe not a bigger or smaller role for the state, but a different role for the state, then you're accepting by logic that society has to step up and accept a bigger role for it. And I think that's a good thing. I do think in terms of the principles of mutual interdependence and reciprocity and democracy and autonomy, our basic needs are best met when we are fully flourishing active humans, I believe. And I don't see anything wrong with not a bigger society in the Cameron sense of the word, but it's a more active society in the concept of a more flourishing society, more able society. I think that's a good aim. And I think the institutions of the state have to partner with society to help us be those people that we need to be in the longer term.
I think that's a brilliant way to finish up.
Yeah.
Mary, thank you so much for your time. Okay. We've held exactly to our hour, so
yeah,
well done.
That's good. Yeah,
And thank you for those who attended. And as I say, this will be going up online and circulated. So with that, I'll say thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Mary.
Bye.
Bye.